Hi everyone, I'm Monica Akimi. Welcome to AJIL Explainers. This is a series that my co-editor-in-chief Ingrid Brunk and I are running to provide expert information and commentary on international law during Trump 2.0. And this episode features Mark Pollack and Jeff Dunoff, both of Temple University, to tell us a little bit about international trade law. And they've written an article forthcoming in the October issue of the American Journal of International Law on which this discussion is based. So thank you, Jeff and Mark, for being here. Thank you for your excellent essay, which should be out soon in AJIL. And let me just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about what actually is happening in the trade space. It seems like every day there's a new story, and so it's quite hard to keep track of what the Trump administration has been doing in this regard.
Yeah, great. So maybe I'll get us started. So first, thank you so much, actually, for the invitation to join you today. And really thank you to the Journal for devoting the space and the time to discuss this really important moment that we're in. It's really great to see the Journal be able to pivot in this way. Mark and I decided to write about tariff policy because we think the months since Trump's inauguration have been the most tumultuous period of U.S. trade policy since at least the end of the Second World War. And what our contribution tries to do is really touch on three broad points. I'll just set them out because I think it'll respond to your question, what's happening, and the idea is to try to bring some clarity out of that chaos, some conceptual clarity. First, I'll just say a few words about the administration's tariff policy. Then I'll discuss the reaction of U.S. trading partners. And then we'll talk a little bit about the implications of all of this for the global trade system. So I'll provide a high-level overview, and then, of course, we can circle back to dig in on any of the details. So first, what's the president done? Well, in brief, relying on a variety of statutory authorities and a slew of orders and directives and investigations and deals, he's unleashed a tidal wave of new tariffs on virtually all goods entering the U.S. from virtually all states. Well, how much did the president increase tariffs? The answer is to their highest level in nearly a century. So pre-inauguration, average U.S. tariffs were something like 2.4%. And before this week's tariffs on lumber and furniture kicked in, the overall effective rate was roughly 18.6%. So tariffs have gone up by like 8 times. The Tax Foundation, a research body, says this is the largest tax increase in modern U.S. history. And the nonpartisan Yale Budget Lab says we should expect everything from food to electronics to other goods to cost more. And the average U.S. household will pay several $1,000s this year. Okay, this triggered a response, many responses. Some states tried to de-escalate. They made unilateral concessions to the US. Other states went in the other direction. So China and Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on US goods. Many states tried to hedge, develop, or build relations with other trade partners. Some challenged the legality of US tariffs. They filed suits at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And then a handful of states signed trade deals with the US, and we devote considerable time on these deals. We think they're quite significant. The paper identifies a number of structural features that are common, but if you step back from those particulars, I think one overwhelming impression is that the deals are deeply asymmetric. So the basic structure is the US raises its tariffs, partners lower theirs. So the US increases its barriers to trade, the signatories lower their barriers to trade. And at the same time, the trade partners pledge massive investments and purchases from the US. The deals have many critics. I'll just quote one Financial Times columnist who wrote that the deals are, quote, closer to a protection payment to a mob boss than a liberalizing agreement between sovereign countries. So if that's right, that raises a really interesting puzzle. Why would powerful trading nations like the EU, South Korea, Japan, why would they enter into trade agreements that are so one-sided? So we have some ideas, and maybe that's an issue we can circle back to. And then the third broad topic, maybe the most important for the journal's audience, is what are the implications of all of this for the global trade order? There's lots of ways to answer that. For now, let me just identify 3 quick ways. So first, a central purpose of the trade system is to produce security and predictability. Predictability is thought to encourage capital investment and job creation, but the rapid escalation of tariff rates and their on again, off again nature, they've actually sparked chaos and confusion. And it looks to some that the administration is intentionally generating insecurity. So it's not simply ignoring trade law, it's actually deliberately undermining one of the system's central purposes. Second, the system is premised on a foundational norm of non-discrimination, so states shouldn't discriminate among their trading partners. But current US policy has bespoke tariff rates on each trading partner. 15% on the EU, 20 on Vietnam, 10% on UK goods, 50% on Brazil. This is the antithesis of non-discrimination. So even though that weakens the trade system, it doesn't mean that these bilateral deals, which reduce these tariffs, actually strengthen it. To the contrary, we think through these deals, other states themselves violate core WTO obligations because they lock in these differential rates. Finally, and maybe most importantly, we think the current policies reject the foundational idea that increased trade is mutually beneficial. Current policy, we think, reflects a radically different view. The assumption that states should seek the mutual reduction of trade barriers has been replaced by the idea that tariffs are a useful tool. We think this policy rejects the idea that trade is a win-win enterprise in favor of one that understands trade as a zero-sum game. And we might even say that these policies replace the principles of multilateralism, non-discrimination, and market orientation for a much more transactional approach that embraces managed trade and focuses on numerical outcomes. So we think in many ways, current policy diverges sharply from those of the past. For sure, past presidents were involved in trade wars, but they were about specific problems with specific countries on specific goods, like a dispute with China over solar panel. Today's policies, in contrast, involve virtually all goods from virtually all countries, and they massively and intentionally breach the fundamentals of the world trade system. I think students of the system recognize this is not an effort to reform the rules. It's instead a direct assault on a global trading order that, ironically, the US did so much to build in the first place. So I think for those committed to a global trade system, this doesn't look like a trade war. Instead, it looks like a war on the trade system.
Jeff, wow, you have thrown out so much. That's just a fantastic introduction. Before we dive into some of the really interesting conceptual issues, let's just also put on the table as we kind of try to understand what's happening. You've talked about the size, just in terms of the amount of money and the level of tariffs. But I understand we're also seeing a real difference in the range, right? When we think about what President Trump is doing, and maybe we could finish sketching out like the current moment by talking about what the range of current tariffs is.
So I can jump in on that. I think as Jeff has suggested, Trump not only increased the average effective tariff from around 2.4% to 18%, he did it through a really dizzying variety of different tariffs on different goods, different countries, with different legal bases and justifications. And so one of the things we wanted to do in our piece in the journal was to help the reader make sense of all these tariffs. And we do it by putting them into five broad categories, five buckets. And some of these will be familiar, some of them won't. I'll go through really quickly. First, we have the so-called fentanyl border tariffs, which were imposed against China, Mexico, and Canada in early February. Trump declared national emergencies at the northern and southern borders of the US related to migration and also to fentanyl trafficking. And then he issued three executive orders imposing 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods above and beyond the tariffs that had already been imposed, and 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, ostensibly to punish those states for their contributions to those emergencies. So we can already see that these are not traditional tariffs. They were imposed to punish other states for non-trade behavior. They were adopted primarily on the basis of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, rather than more traditional Section 301 tariffs designed to respond to other states' protectionism. So that's the first group. big across-the-board tariffs aimed at three of the largest U.S. trade partners. Then we have the so-called 232, Section 232, or national security tariffs. These built on Trump's first-term policies, but the administration claimed that U.S. reliance on foreign steel and aluminum posed an unacceptable national security risk, and Trump raised U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs first to 25, later to 50%. But he didn't stop. Unlike in his first term, Trump didn't stop at steel and aluminum. So it also announced, the administration also announced 25% tariffs on auto and auto parts, and it opened 9 new investigations, 9 new Section 232 investigations into a wide variety of imports, including semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, aircraft parts, but also copper, timber, and even upholstered furniture and kitchen cabinets, to which Jeff has already referred. So most of those investigations are still ongoing, so we should expect a pretty steady stream of 232 tariffs to keep coming over the coming weeks and months. Third, we have a set of so-called national emergency tariffs that were declared against Brazil in July. So in an executive order, Trump declared that the situation in Brazil, with specific reference to the prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, created a national emergency for the US. And on that basis, he imposed 50% tariffs on a wide range of Brazilian products. Fourth, we have another novel category, the so-called secondary tariffs on countries that import Russian oil. So the idea here draws on the notion of secondary sanctions, in that the US can, at the president's discretion, impose punitive tariffs on any country that imports either Venezuelan or Russian oil. So far, those secondary tariffs have been threatened against countries that import oil from Venezuela and Russia, but they've only actually been imposed once, a 25% tariff on India for importing Russian oil. And so fifth and finally, and you've been waiting for me to get to them, we have the so-called reciprocal tariffs that Trump declared in the Rose Garden of the White House on April 2nd. These are the Liberation Day tariffs. Trump's Liberation Day pronouncement started by imposing a new 10% across the board baseline tariff on imports from all trading partners, regardless of their tariff or non-tariff barriers against the US. And then in addition to that, the announcement imposed individualized so-called reciprocal tariff rates on goods from individual US trading partners, ostensibly based on the partners' tariffs and non-tariff barriers to US goods, but actually calculated on the basis of that country's goods trade surplus with the United States. So under this system, imports from 57 different economies would be subject to reciprocal tariffs ranging from 11% to 50%, including 20% for the EU, 24% for Japan, 25% for South Korea, 34% for China, 46% for Vietnam, and so on. Importantly, however, the executive order announcing the tariffs also provided the president with so-called modification authority to adjust tariffs upward if any state retaliates, or to adjust downward if that state agrees to negotiate a new trade deal by the administration's deadline, which ended up being August 1st. So that latter provision triggered a scramble to Washington among U.S. trading partners to do deals. Jeff has already mentioned those, and we'll come back to them. But that's basically the categories of tariffs that we see.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you to both of you for laying out the landscape in the way that you did. And I guess I have, a follow-up question, which is, which builds a little bit actually on Jeff's earlier points about how it seems like a lot of these moves are, first of all, designed to sow chaos and confusion, and second of all, designed to display the current administration's American First policy. So, like you can put those two together and say, like, part of the rationality behind this maybe is to say, we can cause chaos and confusion, we can disrupt the entire thing, and you still, everyone else, are going to come on to and make deals with us and abide by the terms that we deliver to you, however crazy they might seem, because you need us more than we need you, and you're going to accept the new terms for trade that we establish based on our own whims and preferences. And my first question, I guess, is like, is that how you also read the situation? And then relatedly, if so, does this mean basically that our key trading allies, with the exception of those who have responded with some retaliation or antagonistically toward the United States, but for the most of them, is that a gamble that has actually paid off for the United States? Has it actually, from that rationality, has it actually succeeded in showing that it could sow chaos and confusion and it could disrupt the entire system, and still most other states would come crawling back to it and accept these deeply inegalitarian trade rules that prioritize US interests and priorities, however defined, over whatever our trading partners might prefer?
If you're the more optimistic among us, why don't you start?
I'll start, but it may or may not have much to do with optimism. So this is a really great question. And I hear you as asking a little bit like, so what's actually the goal here, right? Like, what's the administration trying to do? And I think this is a big part of the confusion because if people are listening closely to what's coming out from officials in the White House and agencies, there have been articulations of multiple goals. And one, you're going to raise a lot of revenue from these tariffs, like that is a proffered goal. One is you'd like to bring down the US trade deficit. It's a concern that they have been large for any number of years, and the administration now sees that as reaching emergency status, like really needs to be addressed and addressed now. And others that maybe we would build this sort of tariff wall around the US so that all the goods we purchase and consume are made in the US, so we're going to bring manufacturing back. So there's a lot of different answers to this question, what's actually the goal? And I think part of the confusion, both among scholars and I think among trading nations, diplomats from other countries, is it doesn't look like these goals actually are always mutually compatible. So sometimes you hear from Treasury the tariffs are leverage, right, to negotiate down. Is a very sort of traditional articulation. And if that's the case, if they're going to be negotiated down, then we're not actually building a tariff wall. And if they're going to be negotiated down, we're not actually going to be generating all this revenue. So I think a lot of the confusion has to do with what exactly is the goal. I don't think the administration has probably ever quite articulated it the way you have in the question, Monica. I think the closest is probably the president's longstanding position that the existing system is out of balance. The evidence for the fact that it is out of balance are these large and persistent trade deficits year after year. And so if that is the problem, it would sort of beg a little bit, what's the solution? The solution is the constellation of tariff policies that we've been talking about up till now. And we can, and the pundits have been arguing about it. What's the fit between this set of policies as a solution to any of the problems that we could identify?
Yeah, and I think to a very, very large extent, I agree with everything Jeff just said, including about the incompatibility of the administration's multiple goals and the confusion. I would also agree with you, Monica. I mean, Trump likes to be unpredictable. It's one of the things he talks about as a strength of his presidency. And so sowing this kind of chaos, threatening 100% tariffs on pharmaceuticals on Truth Social one day and then announcing the next day that he's going to put them off. These are for him, I think, negotiating tactics. I think, and we'll probably say more about this later when we talk about the deals, a significant amount of this, well, let's just pause and say, I think that Donald Trump, before he was president, during his first term, and now has always believed that the trading system is biased against the United States. He famously once said that the appellate body of the WTO was biased against the United States because we only had one judge. So he's obviously always felt this way. During his first term, he undertook tariffs against a tariff war against China. He imposed the first aluminum and steel tariffs under Section 232, and he paralyzed the WTO appellate body by refusing to allow the nomination of any judges or members of the appellate body. And what we're seeing now is a kind of unleashed Trump. I mean, everyone has said this. Trump no longer has advisors who are trying to hold him back. He has advisors who are trying to facilitate his goals. And so I think we are seeing something that shows the same underlying philosophy as Trump 1.0, but on a dramatically different scale.
I have a really short follow-up question, specifically related to this, the idea that like all these states are coming back, right, to negotiate with us. And this is an IR theory question, right? So, those of us who kind of grew up teaching Andrew Gutzman's like 3 Rs of IR theory, this just kind of throws reputation totally out the window, right? I mean, as I understood the IR theory was always, we want to have a reputation for being a good treaty partner, because if we're not a good treaty partner, people won't come trade with us. I see Trump as just saying that's BS, right? People are going to come trade with us because we have a lot of money and you can sell a lot of goods in our country. And even if we rip up our last set of commitments, I mean, even if we change it from hour to hour on Truth Social, right? All of you are coming back to us to trade because we have the levers of power. Now, am I wrong? And if I'm right, like what's left of reputation? It's just how many toys you have, right? How many carrots and sticks?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say one quick thing and then turn it over to Jeff, which is reputation has always been, I think, more complicated than IR theorists initially thought. And Rachel Brewster has written about this really nicely, to say that yes, reputation for being a good cooperator is potentially a valuable thing to have. On the other hand, reputation for being tough, for not backing down, for carrying out your threats, has also long been seen as very valuable. I think it's clearly the kind of reputation that Trump thinks is more valuable, right? The ability to say, we're going to raise your tariffs to 46% and we'll really, really do it, unless you agree to 19%. I think that is the kind of reputation that Trump is more interested in. And then, of course, if I were a realist, I would say, yes, Ingrid, you're completely right. Market size trumps reputation any day. And what we have seen so far, we'll talk more about the deals, I'm sure, but essentially the shocking thing is the extent to which almost every country in the world has accommodated Trump in one way or another, and in some cases dramatically. So if there's anything that's going to show the value of market power, that's sort of it.
So why don't I ask you then about the nature of the deals, and just to describe a little bit more their terms so that we have something concrete to bite into. And I guess I want to ask you specifically to talk as a follow-up to this conversation, and maybe you can weave it into the conversation about the deals and why other countries have accepted the deals on the terms that they have. This question about the conflation of economic and military power and the dependence of other countries on both simultaneously. And specifically when you're talking about some of our greatest trading allies, which are also some of our greatest security allies, the threat that is looming on the other side of Trump, which is China, and the risk that they might get sucked into China's orbit of power, and the calculation that they might be making that, like, okay, well, for now we should continue to work on this, if only because our security work with these people, the United States, if only because our security depends on it. So I'm wondering if you could, when talking about the terms of the deals and you're telling us how one-sided they are, you could also sort of calculate part of their decision making as being about sort of the broader dynamics at issue, not just on economics, but also on security.
So Jeff, how about if I say a few words about what's in the deals and then you can tell us what they mean?
Okay.
Um, okay, so again, dozens of U.S. trading partners converged on Washington over the summer to negotiate deals. And we should say negotiations are still ongoing with countries like Canada, Mexico, India, South Africa. Poor Switzerland is paying 39% right now. They're very eager for a deal. Um, but so far, the US has concluded trade deals with six important trade partners: the UK, which came first, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And there have been some rumored deals as well, but nothing on paper. Now, each of those six agreements is in some sense bespoke because each agreement reflects Trump's particular grievances with each country, as well as that country's bargaining priorities and its leverage vis-a-vis the US. But one of the things that Jeff and I were trying to do was understand these deals as a sort of new type of agreement in international politics, if not in international trade. And so if we look at how the deals have evolved over time, because they have evolved, we see seven core characteristics. I'll be really quick. First, each and every one of these deals secures U.S. trading partners' purportedly voluntary agreement to the new increased U.S. tariffs, all of which breach past U.S. commitments, and they do it in order to avoid even higher threatened tariffs. So, for example, the EU agreed to a 15% baseline tariff, essentially to avoid a threatened tariff of 25%. Vietnam agreed to 20% to avoid 46%, and so on. So all of these deals are basically acceptance of dramatically higher US tariffs, but lower than the ones that had been threatened. Second, several US trading partners, mostly the advanced industrialized economies, managed to secure various types of exceptions to the new tariffs to blunt their impact on politically sensitive sectors of the economy. So again, I'll give the EU example. The EU won caps on US tariffs for cars, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals, all of which will be at the baseline 15% rate rather than 27.5% for cars and whatever pharmaceuticals and semiconductors will eventually be. So this is a way in which I would say economically and politically powerful members U.S. trade partners have managed to take a little bit of the sting out of these tariffs for key industries. Third, the Vietnamese deal in particular featured an anti-circumvention provision, which is worth noting because it was later generalized to all U.S. trading partners, namely that there's a punitive 40% U.S. tariff for goods that the U.S. judges to have been transshipped through that country from another country, for example, China. So that is a new provision. Fourth, and really unusual with respect to previous PTAs, each of these agreements includes massive purchase commitments or investment pledges or both by U.S. trade partners, essentially turning what's supposed to be a trade agreement into a one-way buy American or managed trade promise. So the EU's is the most spectacular. The EU committed to purchasing $750 billion of U.S. Exports, including liquid natural gas, and it pledged to invest $600 billion in the United States. And even Indonesia, with a much smaller economy, pledged to buy $15 billion of U.S. energy exports, $4.5 billion in agricultural products, and dozens of Boeing airplanes. Fifth, I'm going to echo Jeff here. All of these deals are dramatically asymmetric rather than reciprocal. In virtually all of these deals, the United States raises its tariffs and its partners lower them. So even though Trump calls these tariffs reciprocal, there's really nothing reciprocal about them. Sixth, all of these agreements are concluded as legally non-binding deals. I'm putting deals in quotes here, several of which have yet to be codified by anything other than a unilateral White House statement. And all of them lack third-party dispute settlement, which essentially allows the U.S. to cancel or change them at any time. And then Seventh and last, and I apologize, but seventh, all of these deals, echoing Jeff, rather than rectifying US violations of WTO law, actually compound those violations. They double down and they essentially make our trade partners complicit in those. Jeff, I went on a long time, but you probably have some things to add, no?
I mean, I guess, we can talk more about the deals. Maybe for now, I might just suggest that, I think that constellation of features is really useful way to try to organize these. I would also sort of underscore what Mark suggested, that they may not always be what they seem. So Mark mentioned, some of them are explicitly, and sort of the first page say that they're non-binding. We've already seen they are unstable in many ways. And I'll just mention for now that, these huge purchase and investment commitments, that's actually pretty interesting, in part because many of these announcements simply repackage investment plans that had already been released. But more importantly, these are government pledges of investments or purchases by private sector actors. But states can't simply order firms to purchase, certain goods in a certain amount. And so they can't actually guarantee that any of these high visibility promises will be actualized. And I guess I just remind viewers of the phase one deal with China during the first Trump administration, where China promised as part of this deal to purchase an extra $200 billion worth of goods from the US. And how much of those extra purchases actually took place? Precisely $0 of extra goods. So it is entirely possible that these headline grabbing purchase commitments in these trade deals perhaps will prove to be equally illusory.
So with that super helpful overview of what these new trade deals look like, Jeff and Mark, maybe we can come back to your introduction, Jeff, and talk a little bit about the ways that these new deals and this kind of new world we're operating in represent some like fundamental or like profound threat to the global trade system, not just more of the same. And I heard you say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they kind of do so in two ways, right? They push up against this core idea of non-discrimination, right? So like what's wrong with these from kind of a classic post-World War II sense of trade? They discriminate. And we have this norm of non-discrimination. And then the second I thought I heard was, look, we have this basic sense that like more trade is good, right? Increased trade is a value that kind of the globe can unite around, and in many respects, these kind of push up against that basic assumption that more trade is good. So my first question is that about right? The second question is, could you say a little bit more about where do these normative assumptions come from? It's not totally obvious why discriminatory trade is so bad, at least so where does that come from as sort of the normative underpinning of our entire global trade system? And then the third is like, presumably if we shake up the trade system in this way, some states are going to benefit and some states are going to be harmed. And maybe is it just the United States that benefits, right? Or because I thought the old global trading system had a lot of winners and losers, and are we moving now to a system where there's only one winner and the rest of the world is losers, or is it more complicated than that? So sorry, that was three, but take what you want from them.
And can I just ask, can I put a footnote on Ingrid's third? Like one way, just because I'm also very curious about all three, but I had a thought about the third, which is if it's all sort of a sham, these are all non-binding deals, and it's like part of the circus, and we don't really know what's going to stick. And like, turns out they're just pledging to do things that either they can't do or they had already agreed to do. Is this really just part of the show of wanting to change something, and that we actually have not moved so dramatically away from this? I guess a version of a couple of her questions, moved so dramatically away from the previous regime. We've just done it with a circus to display how powerful we in fact are in the event that we wanted to use our power in ways that were much, much more pernicious to a much wider range of actors.
Yeah, so these are great. Thank you so much. So maybe I'll take the liberty of starting, and maybe I'll address maybe the non-discrimination idea, and then I'm happy to trade off with Mark or speak to any of the others. So yeah, what a great question. So it is an unquestioned, I think, sort of assumption by people in this space that non-discrimination is a cornerstone of the multilateral trade system. And the question is why? And I think there were sort of two standard justifications, and one was way more prominent in the 1940s, not so much now, but the idea was that discriminatory trade policies treating country A better than country B can be seen as triggering both economic and political tensions. They're going to trigger a sense of unfairness, sense of grievance, sense of resentment that in turn run a risk of poisoning international relations more broadly. And if you push this kind of to its extreme, you might say these political and economic tensions can escalate into military conflict. And some people suggest that the economic crises of the 1930s, are a contributing cause of World War II. So we have this sort of political tale. I think those who have studied the founding of the EU will recognize a similar version of a story about economic integration, leading to. So there's this political rationale that we might question today, but that's out there. And then today, I think more standard is an economic justification. And the basic idea is we want to sort of minimize the extent to which government rules distort the market, and non-discrimination, MFN, national treatment, helps to ensure that countries and traders and producers compete on quality and price, that they make a superior product. That's how you get the sale. You don't get the sale because your country faces a lower tariff than the producer in the other country. Even though that other producer is more efficient, they don't get the sale because of this differential or discriminatory trade barrier. So I think the idea is that non-discrimination promotes a sense of fairness, a sense of predictability, promotes open competition, which in turn benefits consumers and businesses. You increase market access, increase efficiency, increase aggregate welfare. I think your final question challenges that justification. So I'm happy to circle back to that, but I'm also happy to invite Mark to respond if we want to go in order, or to any of the other questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to go on.
Yeah, no, I'll just jump in with 3 points because those were really great questions. So on the question about winners and losers. So yes, every trade policy and every trade system is going to produce winners and losers. And there's no question that the WTO system, as it was functioning, was producing winners and losers. And one can make a reasonable claim, as President Trump has done, that the American working class was not necessarily a winner from the WTO system. And so Trump's policies, his new tariffs and so on, will create a different set of winners and losers, for sure. In the first term, there was a general consensus that Vietnam, for example, was a winner, as companies moved production out of China and into Vietnam. And there will be winners and losers from this policy as well. But there's also always been a view but again, Jeff mentioned this, that's a very zero-sum view of trade, right? It's about winners and losers. But of course, there's a positive sum view of trade that says we can increase the pie, we can increase the size of the pie, we can increase aggregate welfare by having a rules-based system. And it's that I think Trump is pushing against. I think Trump very much prefers a power-based system based on spot deals, and bilateralism to a multilateral system. Ingrid, you also asked the question about whether this is a circus. Is it just a show? It is certainly a show. So there's no question in my mind that Trump cares a great deal as a politician about being able to announce wins. If you look at the White House announcements of each of these trade deals, they don't read like traditional USTR, press releases. They have, President Trump wins big sorts of things. And Trump has referred to the purchase and investment pledges that Jeff mentioned as signing bonuses, like in baseball. So there's no question to me that there is an element of theater here. And I agree with Jeff that the investment and purchasing pledges may turn out to be largely fictitious, but the tariffs are real. They're being collected today. And so I do think that the effect of the tariffs, the trade diverting effect of the tariffs, and of course, all right, let me say one last thing, which has to do with comparing Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. So for me, the key thing about Trump 1.0 was not actually the steel and aluminum tariffs or the trade war with China. It was the paralysis of the WTO appellate body, which allows any unhappy WTO member that loses a case to appeal into the void, and basically prevent any final decision from ever taking place. What we now see is that what seemed like the story of Trump 1.0 is actually act one of a two-part story in which Trump can now systematically violate WTO rules, and almost no one bothers to bring a complaint at the WTO because they know it's pointless. Because the United States will claim the national security exception and then appeal into the void if we lose.
Imagine that.
Yeah, I thought if it's okay, I just want to maybe
Yeah.
underscore one thing Mark mentioned, because I think it raises a really important point, and this distinction between sort of the size of the pie and the distribution of the pie. So, the standard economic justifications, theories of comparative advantage, this is all about sort of expanding the size of the pie. And what I love about your question is it kind of refocuses our attention to the distribution. Typically those questions were seen as domestic questions, right? Like that's a matter of domestic policy and domestic law. So it was seen as not in the domain of, trade policy, international policy, WTO policy to address them. One way to hear your question may be to sort of like push just a little bit on that distinction, but there is that traditional line. And if one wanted to cross that line, one would want to think really carefully about the implications. And the other is also to underscore something Mark said, but it's really important. So like the however much show and circus is going on, like the effects are real. There are effects on producers, on firms, on consumers. So tariffs, the average tariff on Chinese goods right now is 58%. 58%. So that has consequences. So for example, China, as of today, is no longer the US's leading supplier of textiles. Vietnam is. So maybe this is a question about winners and losers. Maybe that's good news for Vietnam. But actually, if they're getting those sales because of tariff barriers, it's not because they're the most efficient producers. It actually means that the people in the US who are buying those textiles are now paying more for them. There's both an overall, I think, aggregate welfare loss and particular losses that are visited on American consumers. So I fully appreciate the circus aspect of this, but I think it's important not to lose the other dimensions because they are real and they are happening right now.
If one doesn't necessarily buy the goal of economic efficiency, or one doesn't really buy the objective that we should have more cheap goods, or one doesn't necessarily think we need a bigger pie, we just need it distributed differently, are there better and worse ways to have a global trading system that is discriminatory? I know that's kind of an out there theoretical question. I mean, so, right, the whole thing that we've said we don't want is we can't have discrimination. So like, let's say we're going to have discrimination. We're done with the world of non-discrimination. Is there a way to rethink? Are there any historical models? Are there ways to sort of, does the whole system become bilateral? Like, is there any way to think of a better or worse world? Or once we have discrimination, we've sort of exhausted the resources of sort of international law or the global trading system? Sorry for kind of a diffuse question.
I mean, it's a great question. And so I might take the liberty of maybe like amending it like just a little bit. So I don't know what's a better and worse world. That's a really interesting normative question. A slightly different way to phrase it might be like, what are the trade-offs involved? So you might say the Western democracies or Western Europe or the North American country, like we could imagine regional or other groupings who might say to themselves, we're willing to pay a certain price and a loss of aggregate welfare or efficiency gain. Like there's a price, but there are some other political or strategic or other gains. And maybe what's really helpful about your question is it really like surfaces, like that's what's at issue, right? Like the sort of defense I gave of a non-discriminatory trade world was very much in the name of like increasing the size of the pie. And you entirely appropriately said, well, maybe that's not what we want to do. And so really the question is, bigger pie, I think that's desirable, but it's not the only thing that's desirable, and you are pressing hard and saying, well, there are other things that, and so this is a question about how do we want to make that trade-off? And it could well be that the WTO is not the optimally placed international organization to make that decision or to have where those conversations should take place. I think that's a really good insight. But like that's how I hear your question. That's exactly the question. And precisely much of the grievances that we might understand to drive current trade policy is precisely a somewhat, I think, inarticulate version of like precisely that these trade-offs have been a little bit submerged, right? And that if there's anything useful here, it's maybe like to bring them to the surface.
So could I then use this as an opportunity, please, to shift to one of the other points you made in your introductory remarks, Jeff, and this is of course for either of you. So one of the things you said is like the current administration's approach to trade is an attack not just on the rules of trade, but on the entire system. And Ingrid's question raises the question like, well, maybe the system should change. And as you say, Jeff, my impression is a non-specialist, so you would know if this is inaccurate. But my impression is that the trade system has been sort of stagnant for a while, and so the stagnancy predates the stagnancy on many of the issues that Ingrid mentions: distributional questions about whether we should be building the size of the pie, given, for example, the costs to the environment of like a massive shipping, a globalized shipping environment, and so on and so forth. These questions were not ripe or suitable for WTO legislative action, like action by all of the member states. And so they were not actually, the WTO was not responding to some of these pressures as they were building. And so, the WTO appellate body, although I personally think quite effective at trying to manage the tensions inherent in any global trade regime, there's only so much it can do as an adjudicative mechanism that is dominated simply by virtue of the cost and the nature of the litigation by like the most economically dominant states, right? So part of the question is, okay, so that system seems now fundamentally to be transformed, and we haven't yet figured out what the new system looks like. But the idea that we would engage in this kind of show of economic power and taking it, and especially a show of economic power in relation to China, and figuring out like sort of like who's willing to do what and on what terms, and like where actually are the most significant pressure points among those who might actually engage in a trading relationship, that is the first step toward building something new, is not totally new, right? Like that's sort of that's one version of how we got the WTO in the first place. So if you were so this is a way of saying, trying to be optimistic, or trying to say like, okay, we're not going to have no trade going forward. We're going to have some modified trading system. And if you were trying to sort of read what is happening in the dynamics, the way the different players are sort of interacting with one another to figure out what the terms of that new trading system might look like, what would you say? Would you say that it's like a less universalized system, a more regional system, that it's a system that focuses on some goods versus other, that takes labor better into account than it historically has? Like, there are all sorts of ways in which we might have a trading system that doesn't favor non-discrimination in the way that Ingrid says, but is responsive to these pressures, which have now bubbled to the surface in the most sort of like chaotic perhaps way possible, but nevertheless, and unilateral way possible, but nevertheless have bubbled to the surface. And so something presumably will come out of the back end, or maybe not. And how do you think about that?
Okay.
You want to go first, Jeff?
It seems like I've drawn the short straw here a number of times, but sure, I'm happy to.
I could go first. I could go first. It's up to you.
Please.
All right. So Jeff is going to give a better answer to this than I will anyway, so I should have let him go first. But I think these are, but I'm responding as a political scientist who spends time with international political economists who think all the time about winners and losers and about the way that any trade system is going to be biased. And so, absolutely, the prior system, say the post-Cold War trading system, understood either broadly as neoliberal globalization or more narrowly as the very flawed WTO trade regime. Both created losers, both were flawed. And there are good political and economic reasons to take a step back and say, is that, is trade liberalization at all costs what we want? And of course, very famously, Danny Roderick asked, has globalization gone too far? And so you have lots of folks who are sort of saying, in Roderick's case, policy space is more important than trade liberalization. For other people, it's environmental regulation. For other people, it's protection of worker rights. So I think there is absolutely a discussion to be had about that. What strikes me, and this is not just about Trump 2.0, this I think goes back to Trump 1.0 and the Biden years, which is Trump got the world's attention during his first term. And we've already talked about the fact that the United States has extraordinary bargaining leverage. Um, and the rest of the world, since the first Trump administration, has been basically saying to the United States, you want to reform the system? We would love to reform the system. Let's appoint a rapporteur at the WTO in Geneva to start leading discussions about reforming the WTO system in response to these sorts of concerns. The United States has generally not taken yes for an answer. I don't think either the first Trump administration or the Biden administration, and certainly not the second Trump administration, have really made an effort to engage in a project of reform. And so as much as one would like to think that Trump's policies are the necessary precursor to a rebalancing of the deal. And Jamieson Greer has very famously said that what Trump's doing right now is the Trump round, right, of the WTO. But I don't think the Trump round is leading to any new equilibrium that is any different from simply the great powers flexing their muscles. Jeff, sorry.
Yeah, no. And so just to underscore one dimension of this is that the way in which this has gone down since January has caused such an enormous erosion of trust in the US as a partner or potential partner. I mean, this is the flip side of the reputation thing, that it is really difficult. So one could envision various scenarios, and maybe we can chat about that. But I think in almost any one of them that we could envision, unlike what has been the case, for the last 70 years, the US won't be at the center of it, actually. So yes, a new trade architecture is emerging or starting to emerge or beginning to emerge, like whatever it is. And it's going to be one whose shape is yet uncertain, but the one thing that is certain is that the player that has been the largest and driver up till now, they're not going to be anywhere near the center of it.
So just as a follow-up, is that like a necessary shift that for a healthier trade and global economic order for the United States? So it's true, we're debilitating ourselves as a country, but that this shift is actually what many have said is necessary, and that maybe it's time for other players to play a larger role and to find that they sort of have no choice but to exercise leadership and not say, in the face of the pressures, not say, okay, figure it out, US, and we're coming along, but instead say like, no, 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 we need to figure it out for ourselves, as opposed to relying so heavily on the United States to play that role, that historic role.
Right. So, one way to hear this question is it's a larger question. How do you view the United States' role in the post-war order, and how benign or not do you see the various strands of US hegemony that we've seen? How helpful, how hurtful? And again, I think we should hear that question as like comparative. Compared to what? So yes, someone else might fill that space. Who might that be? Well, it could be Europe, could be China, could be Brazil, could be India. I love the question, but I think to take the next step would be to sharpen it just a little bit and say compared to what, and then we could envision so what kind of rule system would be most advantageous to China if they're in the driver's seat? What kind of rules is right? So I think that would be the kind of what if game one would want to play.
This has been just terrific. I can't believe the hour's gone by. I mean that seriously. It's hard to stop because I have a lot more questions, but I think we do need to stop. I'll just, we have a minute, maybe literally 60, 90 seconds. Jeff and Mark, is there anything it needs to be said that hasn't been said? If so, this is your time.
Jeff, you take the last word.
So if you're in the trade space, at some point very soon, like you run across John Jackson, right? He was a founder, and he famously said that what trade has to do, what trade did do, is on this trajectory from sort of, a power-oriented system to a rule-oriented system. And that's how we conceptualize it. And I think what this moment calls for, and your questions call for, is how do we conceptualize what we're seeing now? Is there some kind of shorthand like John Jackson's that we could apply? So maybe really briefly, I'll just mention two that I at least have had in mind. And maybe they're applicable to trade, maybe other domains, I don't know. So one is that in trade, and maybe others where the president is dissatisfied with the status quo, like we are seeing a shift, a concerted shift from law or rule of law to the art of the deal. Okay, if you want to change your tariffs in the WTO, there's a way to do it. There's renegotiations, there's notifications, there's timelines, there's players who have to be involved. Like there's a whole way to do it. You could do it that way through that whole regularized, legalized process, or you could just do it unilaterally, right? So no genuine notice, no due process, not even a nod towards principles or stability or even-handedness. So this might be one way to think about this shift. And then we'd want to ask if indeed that's the shift, like, is this corrosive to democratic orders? Is it corrosive to the rule of law itself? And I'll just really briefly and maybe provocatively mention another framework that viewers might want to consider. And it's this idea called the dual state, which is the name of a book by Ernest Frankl. And the basic idea is that authoritarian or even fascist states, they do often have they have like two legal systems simultaneously. There's the normal rule of law system, stable. This is the normative state. It governs much of society. You want to buy and sell a business. It's like for many citizens, that's what it is. And then simultaneously and on a parallel track, there's a lawless zone, a zone that operates alongside the normative state. He calls it the prerogative state. And that's all about executive fiat, not law. And that's about arbitrary exercises of power. And the key is that the prerogative state decides where the line is and when that line moves. And over time, the prerogative state expands its reach and it reduces the domain of the normative state, the rule of law state. So I would have said International trade law was firmly within the normative state, both domestically and internationally. It was a highly legalized terrain. And the question is whether it's moving. Has it already moved from that domain to the domain of the prerogative state, where a leader can decide on seemingly arbitrary grounds without normal rule of law procedures what trade policy would be? I think that would be bad. That would be really bad for trade policy. The larger danger, of course, is once the prerogative state is built, it can spread to any domain and be really hard to dismantle.
Thank you so much to both of you. I mean, I don't really want to say thank you after leaving me with that very dark thought, which just confirms many other dark thoughts that I've been having at the current moment. But I do really want to thank the two of you for this extraordinary conversation. I think Ingrid and I are both very indebted to you and very grateful to you for doing this, and also very grateful for your essay, which I will remind viewers to watch to look out for in the October issue of the American Journal of International Law. So with that, I will say thank you. And thank you to our viewers for watching, and we'll see you for the next Trump Explainer.
Thank you so much.